Elena gripped the wheel until her knuckles turned white. The road ahead was nothing but a gray wall of vapor. She leaned forward, pushing her face closer to the glass, but the headlights only bounced back in a dull, milky glare. The wipers swished in a rhythmic, useless loop, smearing the moisture across the view without revealing a single inch of the asphalt. Inside the cabin, the heater hummed, a low vibration that did nothing to settle the tension in her shoulders. She eased her foot off the gas. The car slowed, the tires crunching against loose gravel at the edge of the shoulder. She checked the dashboard clock. The numbers glowed a harsh, artificial green in the dark. Every few seconds, a patch of fog would swirl against the windshield like a living thing, blocking out the world entirely. She tapped the horn, but the sound died instantly in the thick, damp air. She was completely alone, driving through a void that seemed to have no end. She pressed the brake pedal firmly, feeling the car shudder as it came to a complete stop in the center of the lane. Silence filled the space around her, heavy and absolute. The engine ticked as it cooled, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the silence. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the wheel. Outside, the fog did not just sit, it pressed. It felt as though the entire weight of the night was pushing against the glass, seeking a way into the small, warm cabin. She reached out to toggle the air vents, hoping a blast of fresh air might break the stagnant atmosphere. Nothing changed. The air remained thick, tasting of cold earth and wet pine. She looked left, then right, but the side windows were opaque, blocked by the swirling gray mist. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a physical presence that crowded her space, forcing her breath to shorten. She shifted in her seat, the leather creaking loudly, a sound that seemed jarringly intrusive. She could not wait here forever. With a sharp inhale, she turned the key. The engine roared to life, fighting against the heavy air. She shifted into gear and eased the car forward, inching back into the abyss. Her eyes searched the edges of the light, straining to find the boundary where the road met the unknown. But the fog only tightened its grip. The car gathered speed, the tires humming a low, steady drone against the wet pavement. Elena focused on the narrow corridor of light, her grip firm on the steering wheel. Without warning, the fog tore open. A massive shape erupted from the brush to her right, a blur of muscle and shadow that filled the windshield. Elena did not think. She slammed her foot onto the brake pedal with every ounce of force she possessed. The tires locked, screaming against the asphalt as the car fishtailed violently. The chassis groaned, sliding toward the gravel shoulder. The buck lunged across the beam of her headlights, hooves striking the road with a hollow clatter, missing the bumper by a fraction of an inch. The car lurched to a halt, the engine stalling as the sudden silence rushed back in. Elena remained pinned against the seat, the smell of burnt rubber drifting through the vents. Her hands trembled on the wheel, her knuckles aching from the strain. She looked into the darkness where the animal had vanished, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The road ahead remained empty, yet the air felt charged, vibrating with the suddenness of the near impact. She blinked, trying to clear the sudden, sharp adrenaline from her vision, but the darkness seemed deeper now, waiting for the next movement. Elena sat frozen, her chest rising and falling in uneven, jagged rhythms. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic, hollow drumming that echoed the silence of the woods. She wiped her palms against the seat, but the moisture returned instantly. Every muscle in her arms felt tight, locked in the same position she held during the skid. She reached for the ignition, but her fingers fumbled, brushing the plastic housing of the column. She took a long, stuttering breath, forcing her hand to steady before turning the key. The engine sputtered, caught, and then surged into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The sound felt alien in the suffocating stillness of the fog. She shifted into drive, her foot hovering over the pedal as if the road itself might rise up to meet her again. She moved forward, but the car felt heavy, sluggish, as if the asphalt were turning to mud beneath the wheels. She kept her gaze fixed on the narrow cone of light. The road stretched out like a long, dark throat. She was moving, but the tremor in her legs refused to fade. Each shadow on the periphery seemed to stretch and twist, mocking her attempts to regain focus. She was driving, yet she felt like she was merely drifting through a dream that had no intention of letting her go. The road ahead offered no comfort. Elena pushed the car forward, her eyes darting between the encroaching fog banks. The silence of the forest was absolute, interrupted only by the rhythmic click of the wipers. She gripped the wheel, knuckles white, scanning every inch of the shoulder. Then, a shift in the darkness. To her left, a smaller, darting shadow broke the stillness. It moved with a frantic, erratic grace, cutting diagonally across the beam of her headlights. Elena reacted on pure instinct. She yanked the wheel hard to the right. The tires lost their purchase on the damp road, the car sliding sideways in a long, uncontrolled arc. She felt the rear end fishtail, the vehicle tilting toward the soft dirt of the ditch. She mashed the brake pedal into the floor. The car shuddered, coming to a violent stop just inches from the slope. A small, delicate shape bounded into the safety of the trees, a blur of movement that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Elena slumped against the headrest, her lungs burning as she dragged in deep, ragged gulps of air. The engine idled with a mocking, steady hum. Her hands remained locked on the steering wheel, shaking with a sudden, violent tremor that traveled from her shoulders down to her fingertips. The road was silent once more. Elena sat in the idling vehicle, the silence of the cabin heavy and pressurized. She looked at her hands. They were still vibrating, the tremor moving from her wrists into the leather of the wheel. She opened her mouth to breathe, but a sound escaped instead, raw and thin. "That is twice tonight," she whispered. The words hung in the stale air, barely audible over the heater's hum. She pulled her hands back, tucking them into her lap to hide the shaking, but the movement only caused her shoulders to lock. She stared into the rearview mirror, searching the darkness behind her, expecting to see something waiting in the fog. There was only the empty road. She turned back to the windshield, her eyes tracking the way the light hit the mist. The terror was not fading. It was hardening into something cold and sharp. She had missed death twice in the span of 10 minutes. It felt like a pattern, a sequence of events designed to test her limits. She forced her fingers to stretch, one by one, against her palms, fighting the numbness. She gripped the wheel again, the leather cool and unyielding under her grip. She was not meant to survive this, yet here she was. She pressed her foot to the gas, the car lurching forward into the dark. A jagged shape broke the wall of fog ahead. A rusted sign groaned, swaying on a single chain, its neon tube buzzing with a frantic, stuttering light. Elena steered toward the concrete apron. The tires crunched over gravel and broken glass, the vehicle bottoming out with a sharp metallic clang as it hit a deep rut in the lot. She didn't slow down. She drove until the headlights hit the base of a pump, the glare reflecting back into the cabin with blinding intensity. She killed the engine. The silence that followed was immediate, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of the cooling manifold. Outside, the station was a tomb of concrete and shadow. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, erratic streaks across the pavement that seemed to shift whenever she blinked. She sat motionless, her hands still locked on the wheel, watching the light pool around the car. It was a hollow oasis, a patch of artificial brightness carved into the middle of a vast, sightless wasteland. There were no other vehicles, no movement from the station booth, just the relentless, buzzing hum of the light and the biting smell of gasoline hanging in the damp air. She felt the isolation press in from all sides, deeper and more absolute than the darkness of the road. Elena opened the door. The air outside was colder, smelling of chemical fumes and wet earth. She stepped onto the cracked concrete, her boots scuffing against the grit. She walked to the pump, the sound of her own breathing loud in the void. She grabbed the nozzle. It was coated in a thin layer of grime that clung to her fingertips. She jammed the nozzle into the tank, but it caught on the rim, refusing to seat. She pulled it back, forced it forward with a sharp shove, and heard the metal grate against the intake. She squeezed the trigger. The fuel began to flow, a steady, rhythmic gurgle that echoed off the empty station walls. She stood there, watching the numbers on the display tick upward in glowing red digits. The silence of the night felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing against her ears. She stared at the pump, her focus narrowing down to the mechanical pulse of the machine. The flow slowed, then stopped. A sharp, definitive click rang out across the lot, metallic and final. It was a mundane sound, yet in the stillness of the wasteland, It vibrated like a gunshot. She stayed bent over the pump for a second longer, the silence rushing back in to fill the space where the liquid had been moving. Elena pulled the nozzle from the tank and let it fall back into its cradle with a hollow metallic thud. She wiped her hand on her thigh, the grime leaving a dark streak. The cold had settled into her joints, making her movements stiff and clumsy. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen was black, a mirror of the night, until she tapped it. The light hit her face, sharp and blue, forcing her to squint. Her thumbs moved sluggishly over the glass, sliding through the unlock sequence as the wind picked up, whistling through the empty pump bays. She intended to check the time, but the display flickered before she could reach the clock. A notification bar slid down, pushing aside the signal strength icon. It was a news alert, bold and urgent. She stopped breathing for a second, her thumb hovering over the tempered glass. The headline occupied the top half of the screen, a wall of white text against a dark background. She read the first few words, then the rest. Her eyes locked onto the specific detail of the location. The phone felt heavier in her hand, the weight of the information pulling at her grip, while the station lights above continued their erratic, buzzing dance. Elena stared at the screen until the text blurred. The headline mentioned a fatal collision at the intersection of Highway 9 and the Old Mill turnoff. She blinked, shaking her head as if to clear the image. That was the road she had just driven. She tapped the map icon, her pulse hammering against her throat. The blue dot representing her current location sat exactly where the accident report placed the wreckage. She looked up at the darkness beyond the gas station, trying to visualize the stretch of asphalt she had navigated minutes ago. The deer she had swerved to miss appeared in her mind again. The blur of fur, the frantic sound of hooves on gravel. The report stated the driver had struck 2 animals before losing control. Her hands began to shake, the phone vibrating against her palm. She locked the screen, but the image of the wreckage remained etched in her sight. Her chest tightened with a sudden sharp pressure. She took a breath, but the air felt thin. The coincidence was not a coincidence. Every turn she had made, every sudden break, every narrow escape, they now aligned with the exact sequence of events that had claimed a life on that same path. She leaned against the pump, her balance wavering as the realization took hold. A shiver started at the base of her neck and crawled down her spine, insistent and ice cold. Elena dropped her hand, letting the phone dangle by her side. The silence of the gas station was absolute now, the wind having died away into a heavy, suffocating stillness. She looked at her own hands, turning them over in the dim, flickering light. They were steady. That was the wrongness of it. After 2 near misses and the knowledge of a death at the exact same coordinates, her body should have been trembling with adrenaline. Instead, she felt a profound, unnatural calm. She pressed her back against the metal of the fuel pump, seeking something solid, but the surface felt devoid of temperature. The impossibility of her survival began to sink in, heavy and dense. She had been in the same path, at the same time, facing the same obstacles. Yet she stood here unharmed while the other driver was gone. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest like a physical weight. She looked out toward the dark road, the void of the night staring back at her. The reality of the near-death experiences ceased to feel like luck. It felt like a calculation. She was a survivor of a sequence that was designed to be terminal, and the weight of that truth left her breathless. The memory of a bridge in autumn surfaced, the rusted guardrail groaning under her car as she skidded on black ice. She had stopped inches from the drop. Then came the fever of her 10th year, the doctors shaking their heads in the hallway, only for her to wake the next morning with no trace of the illness. She reached out, gripping the edge of the fuel pump to ground herself. These were not singular events, they were a chain. Each time the air had grown still. Each time, a sensation of sudden, inexplicable clarity had preceded the danger. She traced the timeline of her life, the near collisions, the sudden illnesses that vanished without a doctor's intervention, the moments where death had stood at her elbow and simply walked away. She had always called it fortune. She had always called it a second chance. But standing under the buzzing, yellow light of the station, the term felt insufficient. It was as if a hand had reached into the mechanism of reality and pulled her back from the edge every single time. She was not lucky. She was being kept. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. leaving her lungs burning as she fought for a breath that tasted of cold gasoline and impending change. The flickering light above the pump sputtered, then died. The surrounding hum of the station, the distant hum of the highway, the rhythmic clicking of the machinery abruptly ceased. Elena stood in the sudden vacuum, the silence so absolute it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the pump, but the surface felt distant, as if she were touching it through a layer of glass. The world had stopped moving. The insects in the brush held their breath. The wind, which had been a constant companion on the road, vanished entirely. She stood in a pocket of reality that had been carved out from the rest of the night. Every instinct she possessed told her to run, yet her feet felt rooted to the concrete. The anticipation was no longer an internal feeling. It was an external force, a vibration in the air that made the hair on her arms stand up. She tilted her head, listening to a sound that was not yet sound. The universe was holding its breath, waiting for a threshold to be crossed. In that stillness, the darkness around her seemed to pulse, a slow, rhythmic expansion that mirrored the beating of her own heart. The stage was set. The sound began not as a vibration in the air, but as a pressure behind her eyes. It was a low, resonant frequency that bypassed her ears entirely, settling directly into the marrow of her skull. Elena stiffened. Her hand tightened on the pump handle until her knuckles turned white, but she could not pull away. The voice was calm, devoid of inflection, yet it carried an authority that made the concrete beneath her feet feel unstable. "You are worth saving." It resonated. The words were not spoken. They were imprinted. Elena gasped, the sound thin and brittle in the heavy air. She tried to turn her head, to scan the perimeter for a source, but her muscles refused to obey. She was anchored to the spot, a prisoner of her own stillness. The voice continued, unhurried, vibrating through her chest cavity. "You possess a profound purpose." Every instinct she had developed for survival now screamed that she was in danger, yet the message itself possessed a terrifying, absolute clarity. She stood there, a solitary figure under the dead light of the station, trapped in a moment where the boundaries of her mind began to dissolve. She was no longer just a driver in the dark. She was being addressed. Elena pulled against the invisible weight, her lungs laboring to draw air. The pressure behind her eyes intensified until she felt she might shatter. She forced her jaw to move, the sound of her own voice sounding alien against the absolute stillness. "What do you mean?" she cried out. Her demand echoed, but it did not bounce off the pumps or the station walls. The sound traveled into the void and vanished. Before the vibration of her words had even settled, the concrete beneath her boots began to liquefy. It did not melt. It swirled, turning from gray stone into a deep, infinite indigo. Small points of light ignited within the shifting floor, mirroring the movement of stars. She looked down, stumbling as the ground lost its solidity. Her vision blurred, the edges of the gas station peeling away like scorched paper. Trillions of microscopic sparks collided in the void beneath her feet, expanding into a vast, celestial architecture. She reached out, her fingers grasping for the metal pump, but her hand passed through the cold air as if the object had been a mirage. The world was no longer a station on a dark road. It was a gateway. She stood in the center of a swirling galaxy, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting for the voice to explain why her reality had been erased. The voice returned, echoing from every point in the swirling void. It did not sound like a person. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. "Do not mourn the others," it commanded. Those who perished on this road were merely vessels. They were biological accidents, empty of design, filling space until their expiration. They built their small lives, their fragile careers, and their hollow families only as a distraction from their own insignificance. Elena felt a cold spike of nausea. She gripped her own arms, trying to anchor herself to the physical realm, but her skin felt like parchment. "They were just like me," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the roar of the nebula. The voice tightened, sharpening like a blade. "No, you are different. You were never meant to be a vessel. You were forged by the architecture of the universe to perceive what remains hidden to the rest of the herd. While they exist to consume and decay, You exist to witness. She looked up into the darkness, searching for a face, but found only the cold, swirling light of 1,000 dying stars. The implication hung in the air. Her life was not a coincidence, and the deaths she had witnessed were merely the clearing of the stage for her purpose. The concrete station floor had vanished entirely, leaving Elena suspended in a silent, expanding expanse. Above and below, the void stretched into infinity, illuminated by trillions of microscopic sparks. They were not distant stars. They were active, kinetic points of light, darting through the darkness like frantic insects. She reached out, her hand trembling, and brushed against a cluster of these sparks. They felt like static electricity, cold and sharp against her fingertips. They collided with one another, releasing silent ripples that warped the surrounding space. Each impact sent a shockwave through the atmosphere, forcing the void to shift and reshape itself in response. She watched, mesmerized, as a massive torrent of these sparks swirled toward a central point of gravity, crushing into one another with violent, soundless precision. The scale of the collision was impossible to comprehend, yet she felt the rhythm of it deep in her own marrow. It was not chaotic. It was a process of forced assembly. She stood motionless, the gas station completely erased, as the sparks illuminated the vast celestial void with a blinding, rhythmic pulse. The collision was not ending. It was only just beginning. The massive torrent of light ceased its erratic motion. It began to spiral, a funnel of blinding color that narrowed until it targeted her. Elena felt a pressure building behind her eyes, a sharp, rhythmic throbbing that synced with the pulse of the nebula. The sparks were no longer external. They were migrating, flowing into her vision like liquid fire. She did not blink. She could not. Her pupils dilated, absorbing the light until the black of her gaze was replaced by a swirling, multicolored galaxy. The world she knew, the gas station, the road, the fog shattered into geometric patterns of light and shadow. She saw the hidden architecture of reality. Thin, vibrating strings of energy that connected every object, every blade of grass, every breath in the universe. It was a grid of immense, terrifying complexity. She watched as these strings tightened, slackened, and pulled, governing the movement of all things. Her own hands, held up before her face, were now translucent, revealing the same shimmering web pulsing beneath her skin. She was no longer just an observer. She was a focal point. The voice surged, not into her ears, but directly into the center of her consciousness, confirming the transformation. She was seeing the blueprint of existence, and for the first time, the darkness was entirely transparent. The vision remained, a sprawling map of light mapped onto the back of her eyelids. Elena opened her mouth to ask what this meant, but the voice cut through the silence before a single word escaped her. It sounded cold, detached, like a machine calculating the worth of a life. The voice dismissed the billions of people who existed as mere accidents of biology, calling them distractions in a grand, empty theater. It spoke of families, careers, and daily routines as if they were nothing more than static noise. Elena felt a jolt of resistance, but the voice pressed harder. It categorized the vast majority of humanity as temporary, fleeting, and ultimately inconsequential. Then, the tone shifted. The voice turned its focus directly toward her, sharpening its intent. It identified her as part of the 2%, a minuscule fraction of existence explicitly designed to perceive the hidden architecture she now witnessed. She stood frozen, the weight of the realization pressing down on her shoulders. To be part of the 2% was to be severed from the rest of the world. She felt the gap widen between her former life and this new, terrifying designation. The voice did not offer comfort. It offered only the cold, hard truth of her isolation. The isolation stung more than the revelation. Elena tightened her grip on the cold metal of the fuel pump, her knuckles white against the dark. She thought of the long, hollow years behind her, the failures, the losses, the nights spent in silence. She spoke, her voice barely a rasp against the wind. "What about the misery?" she asked. "The years of pain that served no purpose? Was that part of this design too?" She waited, expecting nothing, but the voice returned instantly. It did not echo. It manifested inside the marrow of her bones. "Those years were the whetstones," the voice commanded, its tone devoid of empathy. "They were not accidents. They were the friction required to grind away your hesitation and sharpen your spirit for the path ahead." Elena felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The memories of her struggle did not vanish, but they shifted. They no longer felt like random cruelty. They felt like training. She stood motionless as the gas station lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the pavement. She was no longer a victim of her history, but a tool being honed by an unseen hand. The realization hit her with the weight of a physical blow, grounding her to the earth as the celestial map behind her eyes pulsed in steady, rhythmic agreement. The vision did not fade. It expanded. The microscopic sparks of the celestial void began to align, forming geometric lines that stretched from the concrete beneath her feet toward the horizon. Elena watched as her past experiences, the near misses, the unexpected recoveries, the hollow years snapped into place like pieces of a complex machine. Every hardship she had endured was a coordinate on this map. The voice was silent now, but its presence remained. A pressure behind her eyes that forced her to see the hidden geometry of the world. She saw the road ahead not as asphalt and fog, but as a sequence of deliberate intersections. Her breathing synchronized with the pulses of light swirling in her pupils. The air around the gas station grew thin and electric. She reached out, her fingers brushing the air, and felt the resistance of a reality that was no longer solid. The path was laid out, a narrow, luminous trail cutting through the dark. She was not walking toward an unknown future. She was walking toward an inevitable one. The weight of the night shifted, pressing into her lungs, as the design of her life became the only truth she could perceive. The map was clear. She was the only one who could read it. The flickering lights of the station pulsed in time with the thrumming in her skull. Elena stood motionless, the fuel nozzle still gripped in her hand, but her fear had evaporated. It had been replaced by a cold, hard resolve that anchored her to the concrete. She was no longer a bystander to her own life. She looked up at the dark, vast expanse of the sky and forced the words out, her voice steady and demanding. "If I am forged for this, then tell me the truth," she shouted into the empty air. "What is my purpose? What am I expected to do with this hidden architecture?" She did not wait for a gentle answer. She leaned forward, the muscles in her jaw tight, eyes scanning the darkness for a sign of the entity that had claimed her. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against her eardrums like deep water. She felt the power within her, a dormant engine finally catching fire, and she refused to let it slip away. "I am not a vessel," she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "I am the one who walks the path. Tell me what I am meant to build." Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, unblinking, waiting for the universe to answer her demand. The geometric lines glowing in the air began to fray. Like smoke caught in a draft, the celestial map lost its rigid structure, swirling into chaotic, fading embers. Elena blinked, and the vast void behind her pupils contracted, snapping back into the dark reality of the gas station. Her knees buckled slightly as the gravity of the physical world rushed back to claim her. She gasped, the sound sharp against the sudden silence. The humming in her skull died away, replaced by the rhythmic, metallic ticking of her car engine cooling in the night air. Above the pump, the fluorescent light flickered one last time and settled into a steady, sterile glow. She looked down at her hands. They were trembling, not with fear, but with the residual vibration of the vision. The station was empty. The silence was no longer heavy or electric. It was just the mundane, hollow quiet of a deserted road. She pulled the fuel nozzle from the tank and let it click into place. The smell of gasoline filled her nose, grounding her. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the distant buzz of an insect near the light, watching the shadows on the pavement return to their natural, static shapes. The silence of the station felt brittle, as if it might shatter at a whisper. Elena leaned against the cold metal of the pump, her breath hitching in the damp night air. Then, the voice returned. It did not come from the wind or the darkness. It vibrated against her inner ear, sharp and cold as an icicle. "You will know when the time is right," it echoed, the words layered with an ancient, detached authority. Elena straightened, her muscles locking as she scanned the empty lot, but there was only the rhythmic buzzing of the overhead lamp. The voice deepened, vibrating through her very marrow. "Remember, you are not like the rest. You are a deviation from the sequence." She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough texture of the pump, seeking a point of reality to anchor her. The voice lingered for a heartbeat longer, a final, chilling note of possession. "I am watching." The frequency of the sound flattened, then vanished entirely, leaving behind only the hollow drone of the highway in the distance. Elena stood motionless, the weight of the instruction settling into her mind, turning her gaze toward the dark horizon where the road disappeared into the mist. The absence of the voice left a void in the air more profound than the darkness itself. Elena remained perfectly still, her hands still gripped around the fuel pump handle. She did not look for the source of the sound anymore. The realization arrived not as a thought, but as a total rearrangement of her sensory input. The gas station was no longer a place of transit. The concrete beneath her boots felt porous, almost translucent, as if she could see the heat radiating from the earth. She released the pump handle. It clicked into the cradle with a metallic snap that echoed like a gunshot across the lot. She turned her head slowly. The shadows cast by the flickering overhead light no longer seemed to obey the laws of physics. They stretched toward her, tracing patterns that looked like geometric equations on the pavement. She took a step back, her boots crunching on loose gravel. Every sound was amplified, distinct, and layered. A truck rumbled miles away, yet she could hear the specific rhythm of its tire treads against the wet road. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her keys, and felt the cold, jagged metal. The world remained, but her place within it had shifted. The environment was the same, yet she was no longer a part of its sequence. Elena walked toward the car, her movements precise and economy-driven. She opened the door, the hinges clicking with a sharpness that cut through the night air. She slid into the seat, her skin brushing the cold, synthetic material of the upholstery. Her hand hovered over the ignition. The key felt heavy, a singular piece of steel that served as a bridge between her intent and the machine. She slid it into the cylinder and turned. The engine surged to life, but the sound was different. It did not roar. It hummed with a rhythmic, pulsing frequency that matched the vibration she felt in her own fingertips. She looked at the dashboard. The needles flickered in the low light, their movements appearing synchronized with the distant pulse of the highway. She placed her hands on the steering wheel, fingers locking into position. The cabin felt less like a vehicle and more like a terminal, a station from which she could observe the mechanics of the world outside. She looked through the windshield, watching the fog swirl in patterns that seemed to reveal a hidden grid across the asphalt. She shifted the gear into drive. The car responded instantly, a seamless extension of her own will, ready to move through the dark. The tires gripped the asphalt with a dry, rhythmic friction as she pulled back onto the dark road. Elena kept her gaze level, her hands firm on the wheel. The fear that once constricted her lungs had evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She drove past the spot where she had swerved to avoid the fawn, but she did not even glance at the brush. Her eyes scanned the environment, noting the precise angle of the fog banks and the way the light from the dashboard reflected off the glass. A sudden movement flickered in the periphery, a branch snapping or an animal shifting in the dark, but she did not flinch. She adjusted the steering by a fraction of an inch, maintaining her speed with mechanical consistency. The road ahead, once a source of dread, now appeared as a series of coordinates. She watched the lines on the pavement flow toward her, observing the way they converged into the distance. The darkness was no longer an obstacle. It was a transparent layer she saw through with ease. She pressed the accelerator, the engine responding with a steady, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the chassis. She was moving with purpose, and the path ahead felt entirely under her command. The road stretched into the void, a ribbon of gray stone beneath the moonlight. Elena maintained a steady speed, her posture rigid and focused. She no longer scanned the ditches for movement or the shadows for threats. Her field of vision had narrowed to a sharp, singular point on the horizon where the black earth met the sky. She noticed a pattern in the way the trees lined the shoulder, not random, but spaced according to a rhythm she could almost calculate. A signpost rushed past, its rusted metal reflecting a light that seemed to pulse in synchronization with her own heartbeat. She did not look at the speedometer or the fuel gauge. Her attention was anchored to the shifting geometry of the world ahead. Where she had once feared the darkness, she now saw the absence of light as a canvas, She reached out and touched the glass of the windshield, tracing the faint outline of a constellation that seemed to align perfectly with the trajectory of her headlights. She was no longer a traveler navigating a dangerous route. She was an observer decoding a sequence. Every mile marker, every bend in the asphalt, and every flicker of distant light became a coordinate. She leaned forward, eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for the next intersection in the design. The landscape began to shift, the simple country roads splintering into a complex web of junctions and intersecting blacktops. To any other driver, the lack of signage and the heavy fog would have been a trap. For Elena, the path was illuminated by a logic that bypassed her eyes. She steered with a fluid, constant motion, turning the wheel not because she saw the road, but because she felt the geometry of the route aligning beneath her tires. She ignored the primary highway, banking sharply onto a narrow, overgrown lane that appeared to be a dead end. The car surged forward, tires biting into the gravel with absolute certainty. She did not hesitate at the fork. She simply leaned into the curve, her hands dancing across the leather wheel as if following a pre-written score. The world outside the glass became a blur of motion, yet she saw every detail with terrifying clarity. She was reading the architecture of the terrain, translating the silence of the night into a set of precise, inevitable directions. Every mile was a deliberate choice, every turn a calculated step in a design she was only beginning to understand. She did not look back. She did not wonder where the road led. She simply followed the map that only she could read, driving deeper into the dark with the precision of an instrument. The asphalt ended abruptly, giving way to a track of packed earth that vanished into the thickest fog yet. Most would have slammed the brakes. Elena did not even take her foot off the accelerator. The car surged forward, the suspension absorbing the sudden change in terrain without a jolt. She was moving by instinct now, a rhythm dictated by the map she carried in her mind, rather than the one etched on the ground. The engine hummed with a steady, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate through the frame of the vehicle. Outside, the world had dissolved into a monochromatic void, yet she steered with the precision of a master. She passed through the shadow of a forest that felt ancient, the trees pressing close enough to brush the side mirrors. She did not flinch. She watched the horizon, where the darkness began to thin, revealing a pale, unnatural glow that pulsed in the distance. This was not a destination found on any map, but a point of origin. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the light. The path ahead was empty, yet she drove as if the road were crowded with ghosts of the future. She accelerated, the taillights fading into the mist, leaving the mundane world behind forever. The journey had not just begun. It had finally reached its true starting line.